Hi, and welcome back to our series on doing a PhD. Today we're talking about your Viva, which is also known as your oral defense. I'm joined today by Dr. Alex Lloyd and also Dr. Beatrice Hayes, who are joining me together by the same camera. They're also a kind of power couple in the psychology world, I suppose is one way to describe them. How are you both doing?
Good.
Very well.
Much better after that discussion. I'll take
very,
that.
very generous.
Thank you. I do like to be flattering to my guests. So actually, both of you completed your PhDs not that long ago. I wasn't sort of too far behind you as well. I did mine a couple of years before you too. So it's not been that long ago that you did your Vivas. And I guess one thing to kind of talk a little bit about with a Viva is perhaps what your kind of initial impressions were when you kind of started your PhD. What did you necessarily think about this idea of having to speak to other people, these experts in your field, about the work that you had done and try and defend it? What were your initial impressions going into your PhD about what that would be like?
Can I answer that?
Yeah, I think for me, my kind of initial thoughts were that it was going to be quite sort of combative. I thought that people would be quite sort of ready to pick apart the work and be less kind of collegial about it, not in a way that was kind of, really negative, but I expected it to be quite a tense discussion with the idea of obviously trying to pick apart what you did, why you did it, and for all the right kind of academic reasons. But compared to what it was like when I actually did my Viva, I felt that it was a lot more kind of discussion based for my actual Viva. So I think that's probably how it differed from my initial opinions.
Was that the same for you, Beatrice? And did your opinion for both of you kind of change after you've done your Viva? Did you feel that your initial feelings were kind of founded or unfounded?
So I was similar to Alex in terms of I thought it was going to be a real case of like, you're on trial almost. Like you had to really defend your research. And honestly, I was absolutely terrified. Like the thought of doing the Viva, I remember at the beginning of my PhD just thinking, there's no way I'm going to be able to do that. But actually, in terms of when my perceptions changed, actually, I found that in my final year, as I was writing up, my perceptions really started to change then. Like literally, I'm talking like 6 months, 3 months, 2 months, 1 month before, because I think you actually realize that you do know what you're talking about and you have done all the research. It is your work, it is your PhD, and you've invested so much time and thoughts into it that actually it's not as terrifying as you think it's going to be, because if it is your work and you have done it, then you can answer the questions. So actually, in terms of like were my initial fears like founded or unfounded, like honestly, I did not need to be as terrified as I was. And I say that to PhD students now, like I promise you, when it comes to your Viva, you will feel ready. So yeah, similar to Alex, and definitely my perceptions changed as I neared my Viva.
Yeah, I mean, definitely that was what it was like for me. I actually got quite excited about doing my Viva towards the end of it. At first I was quite nervous, and then you spend all this time doing all this work, getting really interested in your area, and it's like a great moment where you can find, I can actually talk about it with someone who knows this kind of stuff other than just what I've talked about with my supervisor, etc. So I actually really enjoyed it. Obviously a Viva can be quite a long process. It can take many hours. I don't know if you can remember how many hours your Viva sort of lasted. It can seem a bit scary when sometimes people hear like, it took sort of 4 hours, 5 hours. But do you remember how long yours kind of went for?
Yours was longer than mine.
Yeah, so mine was 3 hours, and I remember sort of preparing for about 2 hours, having had sort of friends, and you had yours a bit shorter. So I was like, probably about 2 hours. And then it got to the first hour, and they were like, right, we'll start talking about the studies now. And I was like, this is going to be longer. So yeah, mine was 3 hours in total, and it was intense.
Yeah, mine was 2.5, so not shy off of yours. But yeah, I was waiting for Alex to finish. Like I was literally in the building waiting, and I was looking at the time thinking, oh my goodness, like I hope it's going okay.
But it is super variable. So one of my colleagues, his Viva was an hour.
Yeah.
And he said it was like shorter than his upgrade. So yeah, he had a really good experience.
I think it just really varies. And I don't think there's necessarily like, it doesn't mean if it's long, that doesn't mean it's bad. If it's short, that doesn't mean that it's good. I think it just varies, and it varies on, I think it really depends on the style of your examiners and how they want to conduct the Viva. So although it may sound scary to have more hours in the Viva, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
It can be a sign of interest from the examiner's point of view. You know, they just really want to know what you've done because they really like the topic.
It just varies.
That's what I
think.
Yeah.
And of course, obviously, your Viva's actually differed in a quite tangible way as well, because Beatrice, I believe you completed your Viva during the pandemic when face-to-face wasn't really a thing. So how was that for you? And Alex, maybe you could speak a little bit about what it was like doing it face-to-face. I don't know whether your experiences, now you've discussed it together, did it really kind of dramatically differ?
I think so, in terms of, for me, it was kind of, I guess we've all experienced it like throughout the pandemic when we would have conversations with our friends over Zoom or FaceTime or whatever. And you have that kind of, it's a bit more question, answer, because you don't have that natural environment of like curating a kind of natural discussion, or if you know what I mean, it's a little bit more stunted. So initially I was kind of concerned it was going to be like that. Although there were some times where it did feel a little bit kind of strange having such a intense conversation and not physically being in the same room. I would say that thankfully the sort of discussion did actually manage itself quite nicely. It didn't feel too question, answer. But I think it was strange in terms of like, at the end when they were like, oh, congratulations, you know, you've passed, blah, 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 you know, and we all sort of raised like a glass of champagne. And then I sort of ended the call and was like, right then, end call. Like, and it's a bit weird, like like mentally, if you know what I mean, and emotionally. And of course I had like business on top and then like leggings and fluffy socks like on the bottom. So that was like, yeah, I think it was just, it was fine, but I think it was very different to yours.
Yeah, like I definitely had a more, I guess, dynamic discussion just because of the nature of being in person versus on Zoom. So that was nice. It felt much more like a full discussion, and that element of it I really enjoyed. I guess the element that now that I'm thinking about it probably is beneficial of having it on Zoom is that like, so I went into a room that I'd never been in before and had to have my thesis in front of me and had to be like flicking through that during the Viva. Now, I think for you kind of like were able to sort of plan in advance where everything was going to be, really get set out before the Viva started and sort of get a bit more comfortable with your physical surroundings, which I think when you're sort of so on the spot and you're trying to flick through, you know, your sort of 300-page document to try and find like a particular test that you've done, like I think that can be quite stressful at the moment. And I remember certain times like trying to flick through things and losing pages and stuff. So actually being a bit more in control of your physical environment can be an advantage. But then saying that you don't have the same benefit of the kind of the more dynamic discussion.
Yeah, that's true.
Can I perhaps add in another potential advantage of doing it online? As Beatrice was describing, having done hers on Zoom, I was thinking that if there's a tough question that comes up, you can sort of feign internet problems so you don't have to answer the question. That would be a pretty handy trick to have had.
Or just leave and pretend that your internet cut out.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I should have done that.
So you kind of briefly touched on your examiners earlier, and I'm just kind of wondering if maybe you can talk a little bit about what you felt that they were like. So for those of you who are not familiar with how a Viva works, you typically have two examiners, one that's kind of classified as an internal, so someone normally from your department, and then what's an external examiner as well, who's typically someone very, very connected with the area that your thesis sort of deals with. What did you think your examiners were like? Did you find they asked really kind of sometimes really tough questions? Did you find it quite a kind of grilling, or was it more kind of supportive and trying to kind of get an understanding of why you did certain things, etc.?
Do you want to go first?
Go on, you go.
So for me, I had one person from not the Royal Holloway department, but because we're University of London, I was able to have someone that was internal, but from Birkbeck, and she was lovely. She was really like thorough, but was kind of more the kind of, I guess, theoretical side, and sort of because a lot of my PhD involved computational modelling, it wasn't a methodology she was familiar with, so she kind of understood the developmental context for what I was talking about, but didn't have that same methodological detail. So a lot of her questions were more about kind of how it situates within the literature, how it kind of relates to these concepts that are described verbally rather than like mathematically. So that was really interesting. And I think that it was interesting because the internal led the Viva, and that was quite interesting because she sort of guided this discussion and kind of where we were going with it and how long we'd spend on certain sections. Whereas my external examiner was also developmental, but was someone who was very knowledgeable in the methodology as well. And so I think my Viva was quite interesting because it was a mix between sort of more theoretical questions and more methodological questions, and it's quite evenly split actually. So that was really interesting from my perspective. And in terms of how they kind of pushed, they definitely pushed at some points because I think, you know, they need to see if you know your stuff. But at the same time, I think towards the end of the Viva in particular, a lot of the discussions were around sort of like, oh, you know, you could do this as well. And it was like, there were suggestions of ways we could change some of the papers that were not actually included in corrections that I then got, but actually were just ways of thinking about improving the paper for, you know, a better understanding of this subject. So I do think it kind of transitioned from early on being more kind of like, right, we're going to grill you on some specific details now, some specific questions, to later on being more like, these are some ways you could think about this differently and might help to further improve the papers.
Yeah, and I had a pretty similar experience in terms of like having someone who was obviously internal that I actually knew pretty well, and then the external person being a bit more, so he kind of understood the applied aspects of my research. So that was really useful because my research was to do with children, and I'm an ex-primary school teacher. My external examiner was also an ex-primary school teacher. So that was really useful because in terms of like the applications, he kind of understood why I was doing some of this research. And so that was really nice because again, it just kind of added another nice lens for the discussion, if you know what I mean. So yeah, they were really friendly though. They were really, because like I said, they do push you because obviously they need to know that you know what you're talking about, but no examiner goes into it wanting to fail or wanting it to be a bad experience. Like, you know, they want it to go well, they want to be friendly. So yeah, they were really nice, and they made it a really enjoyable discussion.
And I think it's probably important also just to sort of note that nobody necessarily expects when you do your Viva and you kind of finish your PhD that, you know, you're the finished article. There's still a lot more sort of to learn. Over the last kind of 4 or 5 years, I've learned tons more about not only the research that I do, but also statistics and methods and so forth. So, you know, it's fine to have, you know, kind of weaknesses to your knowledge. And so it's really kind of a supportive kind of back and forth process where they're asking you questions so they can perhaps try and be kind of collaborative in helping you understand maybe deficiencies in your understanding or where you could have improved the work that you did, rather than necessarily trying to pick apart everything in a way that's kind of wholly unconstructive. So I'm kind of wondering what sort of were the immediate kind of outcomes as well as the kind of long-term outcomes. What happened when the kind of final question was asked? They normally ask you to leave the room. How long did that take until they came to a decision for both of you? And what was the actual outcome that you had?
Shall I go first?
Yeah, go for it.
So obviously, because mine was online, it was a bit weird in terms of, so they sort of thanked me for the discussion and they said that they would then go and have their chat. So I left the call and then my supervisor was like, keep an eye on your phone because I'll text you when to like come back into the call. So I sort of hovered for a bit, had a glass of water, cuddled my dogs and then got the text. So went back onto the call, and yeah, no, it was really lovely. And then they kind of explained that I passed, and that I had minor corrections, and they sent through a document which had those minor corrections listed. So for mine, I do think minor corrections actually quite vary, but for me, it was predominantly things like changing some of my phrasing, grammatical and spelling errors and things like that, and just kind of making a few sections like a little bit more clearer, or like changing the focus ever so slightly. So it didn't take me very long at all to do my corrections. And when they're done, you then send them to the doctoral school who kind of check them with your examiners and blah, 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 blah. And then you get a certificate and an email being like, it's all done. so that was kind of like the sort of formal stuff, I guess, that happened. But it is a weird feeling. It's a strange feeling when you kind of get that official thumbs up. Well, it's a weird feeling when you finish your Viva, because I came out of the room that I was sat in, and Alex was there, my parents, and we had like a nice meal and things like that. But it's just strange. It's a strange feeling when you spend so long working on something and then it's like done. Like, it is a strange feeling, but yeah, it is really lovely. And then once it's all done, it's nice to kind of be like, I'm a doctor now. Excellent. So yeah, I guess that's kind of the more sort of short-term sort of things that happen afterwards. I don't know if you want to comment on more about the longer term things.
Well, and to be fair, like all my short term stuff was similar to you. I guess the difference was that because mine was in person, I just popped downstairs with my supervisor, had a bit of a chat during that 10-minute waiting period, and went back up, and they were like, yep, you passed. And I think I remember saying, like, I don't know what to do now that I've only ever really imagined up to this point. So it is bizarre. And we just then like had a chat, had a drink, and then left. But I mean, what do you mean in terms of like longer out terms? Because
I guess like obviously there's like graduation and things like that, but then it's like I guess it depends on what you've got planned after your PhD as well. Like, I know, for example, you were already in your postdoc. I was a part-time TA at Royal Holloway at the time. And then I moved on to my postdoc TA position. So again, I think the sort of long-term next steps really depends on what you want to do after your PhD. Like, if you want to go straight into a postdoc, or if you want to have a break or whatever. So yeah, I spent some time as a part-time TA, which was really nice actually, because then I worked on getting my publications out there and things like that. So yeah, no, you just sort of go on to the next thing then. You're just like, right, next.
Yeah, I mean, I need to submit my corrections in March. I don't think I'm in the long term. Yeah, I'm still in the short term. I've got my graduation next month still.
Yeah, but yeah.
So if you were to kind of give maybe some tips to somebody who's got their Viva coming up, or maybe is nervous about their Viva, kind of looking back on the last sort of 3 or so years that you did your PhD, what would be the kind of essential tips that you would give to a PhD student who's feeling nervous about what's kind of coming in the future?
I've got a few. So I've got a few, and they're in short, so I'll try and reel them off. But I'd say one would be during the PhD, just make a comment or a note why you made all your decisions, because I think that's kind of a lot of the Viva is identifying why you made these choices. And as long as you can explain it and it's not completely wrong, they will, for the most part, acknowledge that, it might not be the most optimal way of doing things, but if there's a rationale behind it and you can explain that rationale, and then that's all good. And so commenting why you did things along the way is really important. I would say doing a bit of exercise before the actual Viva really helps with the nerves. Like, I went for a run before my Viva, and it just helps you to kind of stop being in your head about it so much. And then I guess the only other thing I'd say is it does help, although you might not need to actually do it, preparing like a sort of 3-minute kind of pitch of what your entire PhD was about and the kind of narrative actually helps you to sort of work out in your own mind kind of how you would explain it. And so even if you don't have to use that summary, being able to draw on parts of that in the Viva can be really helpful.
Yeah, those are good tips. I think I have 2 main ones. I would say my first main tip would be, it's great to listen to other people's experiences of their Vivas, but don't put too much weight on other people's experiences, because honestly, I'm yet to meet 2 people who had the exact same Viva. Every single person I've ever asked about their Viva has given me like a slightly different, nuanced experience. So although it's good to kind of hear about other people's experiences, don't go into it thinking, oh my goodness, that's exactly what I'm going to go through. And my other tip, and this sounds extremely millennial, but trust the process. Do trust the process, I swear. By the way, just for context, like, I said that whilst I'm looking at a pink Mac on like a white desk with pink. This is a very millennial looking desk. But truly, at the end of the day, when you get to your Viva, you've gone through an upgrade, you've gone through various different types of annual review or whatever your university may call them. You know, you've had meetings with your supervisors. At the end of the day, your supervisors aren't going to let you go into a Viva if they think you're going to crash and burn, because on a purely selfish note, it looks bad on them. So as bad as that sounds, like at the end of the day, the university wants you to do well, the department wants you to do well, your supervisors want you to do well. So if you're at that stage, you're clearly good enough, you clearly know your stuff, because your university, your department, your supervisors are confident enough in you to put you in that situation. So just remember that, and remember that you are ready, and you can do it and you will do it. So those are my 2 tips.
Yeah, I think that's a great last tip that you gave. And I'm just going to kind of throw 2 extra into the mix. I think, you know, firstly, I think sometimes it's just okay to say you don't know, that, you know, you can accept, look, that's something I didn't think about, but it's a good point. And, you know, it gives you reflection for what you can do better in the future. The other one is, if you really are anxious, you know, often supervisors will sit with you and do a mock Viva as well, if you find that's going to be really useful just to get that long-term practice. And finally, I'll give a 3rd tip, because it just came to me, which is not really for kind of pre-Viva, but it reminds me of what happened for me kind of post-Viva, which is you obviously want to think about your celebration and, you know, what's going to happen afterwards. But probably, for me at least anyway, I should have done it the next day, because what I didn't anticipate was about an hour after my Viva ended, how tired I was. And I remember being out with my friends,
so true.
Really just wanting to be in bed, wishing that I hadn't organised going out for some celebratory drinks, wanting to just be at home, just watching TV and sleeping, because it really is quite a draining, it's fun, but very, very draining to speak for so long and talk about some intense stuff for quite a while. So that would be my final tip for any of you listening.
Completely agree.
I totally agree with that. I had a party like 6 months later or something. Like it's
still tired,
and I was still tired to this day. When does it end?
Well, I think we'll leave it on that note. So thank you both of you coming on to give your impressions and thoughts about what it was like for your Viva. You know, and obviously it's great to have you both back on the channel, and hopefully we'll have you back again soon.
Definitely.
Hurrah.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for watching the Psychology Debrief. If you have any suggestions for new topics, quizzes, or any other content psychology related, feel free to get in touch via email or Twitter. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Bye!